copies of the slides?
Yes. Yep. Okay.
Oh, good.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, this is Jennifer Schaus, and we are beginning our third week of our government contracting webinar series. There's a total of 7 weeks of government contracting webinars. They are all recorded. They're all complimentary. You can find the full schedule on our website. And thanks everybody who has taken time out of their day to join us. Our webinars are pretty short and sweet. They'll be finished by 12:30. And today we are joined by Mary Beth Bosco, who's going to be talking about a very hot topic, the cybersecurity deadline for Department of Defense. As I mentioned, the webinars are on our website. A list of our services is also there, which includes anything from capability statements, proposal writing, SBA, 8A certification, GSA schedules, and so forth. We also host networking events and various seminars throughout the year. You can find those on our website, either under the event section, or if you sign up for our newsletter, which is complimentary, you'll stay abreast of all of our upcoming events. A little bit about me here, but more importantly, I'd rather talk about Mary Beth Bosco. She's with Holland & Knight Law Firm, obviously a large firm, very well known, over 1,000 attorneys covering or focused on various topics, including government contracting. And Mary Beth has over 30 years of experience. She focuses a lot on compliance, training programs, audits, procurement investigations, and just navigating the federal market for various size companies. So Mary Beth, thanks so much for joining us today. I'll let you jump into the topic here of cybersecurity, which many people are very interested in, and we'll dig into the first slide, and I'll give the floor to you. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Jennifer. We're going to cover a little bit more than the DOD regulations because we want to give you sort of a context to how they came about, and we'll fly through some of the civilian agency requirements and then talk about practice pointers. So Jennifer, we're going to skip through some of the slides. You can, next slide. So this slide, we all know that cybersecurity is important, but I thought this slide is helpful because it shows what the average cost of a data breach is by the size of the company. And you can see it ranges from close to 5 million to close to 12 million. So not only is it required by the FARS and the DFARS, it's an expensive thing on the back end if you don't get the front end correct. Next slide. Next slide. Here's the regulatory framework. It's difficult for government contractors because there are so many different regulations. They overlap. Sometimes they conflict with one another. So, and they can change. For example, the National Defense Authorization Act each year might have a new cyber provision in it. But the basic structure is that you have the Obama Executive Order 16636 called Improving Critical Infrastructure in Cybersecurity. You then have what's called FISMA, the Federal Information Security Management Act. And that really is what is the legislative authority for imposing cybersecurity regulations. It actually governs the government's own cyber hygiene, but the government is allowed to apply it to its contractors. And that's how we get the DFAR and the FAR provisions. FISMA looks to NIST, which is an organization, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. Next slide. And NIST has set forth what they call, next slide, what they call special publications. And these are the actual standards that apply to government contractors. So the way NIST works, way the framework and the NIST publications work is that they're all about assessing risk. And so what each NIST publication does is try to place your particular company, or give you the tools to place your particular company into its risk category, and from there the guidance, the publication will tell you what you need to do. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. So here's the NIST guidance that will apply to federal government contractors. And this is what's in the DFARS right now. We expect the FAR to adopt these same standards. So NIST Special Publication 800-171 addresses controlled unclassified information. And it is really aimed at companies that touch government data in one way or another. The government either gives them data to put on their systems, they process government data, they're using government data, and they touch the government system in that way. NIST 853 is more stringent, and it is aimed at contractors who are actually doing work on physical work on government systems, maintaining them, operating them, or have designed the system or are providing hardware to the government. So if you're sort of in the system versus touching the system, 853 will apply to you. Next slide. So this brings us to the DOD regulations. The important thing about the DOD regulations is that the deadline is December 31st of this year, and there will be no extension of that time. What the DFARS does is they basically establish minimum security controls for safeguarding what's called covered defense information. They establish a mandatory 72-hour reporting requirement when there's a breach or incursion in a contractor's system. It's also important to recognize that there are no exceptions for small businesses. Even if you're a business with, 3, 4, 5 employees, if you do work for the Department of Defense and if you have covered defense information, you are covered by these regulations. The only real exception is for commercial off-the-shelf items. If that's all you sell to the government, you don't have to worry about the DFARS. For larger companies, the clauses have to be flowed down to subcontractors when CDI is necessary for performance of the subcontract. If you take DOD at its word, it will be expecting its prime contractors to vet its subcontractors' cybersecurity practices. We have not really seen this in practice yet, but it will make 2018 a pretty interesting time for prime contractors. Next slide. So the first thing, and probably the most important thing, and the thing that's giving everybody the most heartburn and raising the most questions, is what's covered. Just because you do business with DOD doesn't mean necessarily that you have covered defense information. So it's unclassified technical information or other information that requires safeguarding or dissemination controls. So for example, it includes export control information, Covered defense information also includes information that's protected by the Privacy Act. It also includes, say, DOD operating information, information that would be able to tell a foreign power, for example, where troops or equipment are moving. Now, the DOD is supposed to tell you in your contract what CDI is being transmitted to you so that you will know exactly what is protected. The problem is, in practice, they've been marking everything CDI, so that's caused an issue. Next slide. Next slide. So this shows you, so now we know what's covered. Here are the two protection levels. If you are operating a system or service on behalf of the government, like we saw with the NIST 853, the more stringent standard, the contract will set forth what your specific cybersecurity requirements are. If you are just supporting DOD contracts, in other words, you've got covered defense information in your system, then you've got to meet the standards in NIST 800-171. And what 800-171 does is break down cyber-related or information security activities into 14 families, such as things like access control, or change control, or identification, and provide both basic requirements and then what's called derived requirements. Next slide. The derived requirements are more specific. The basic ones are very high level. Your system should be able, for example, your system should be able to, detect incidents in your system. The derived requirements will then tell you what the more specific standards are. Next slide. It's also important to note that the DFARS will require companies to have system security plans by the end of this year. And an SSP has to describe the system architecture, how the system interfaces internally and externally, what your physical personnel security is, what your acquisition practices are for IT-related software and hardware, and again, what controls you have. We're going to come back to this because there are some things that you should be doing now to prepare for this. Next slide. Again, probably the most controversial part of the DOD cybersecurity requirements is the reporting requirement. If you suspect or you have, credible evidence of a breach, you have to report it within 72 hours. There's a list of information that is supposed to be included in the report, but DOD will accept interim reports if the time period is too short to include all of the required information. Subcontractors have to report cyber incidents to their prime contractors. So as we noted before, these requirements are going to impact the dynamic between primes and their subs. What the report must do is assess the impact. It must describe what actually happened. It has to include what was the compromised information and what was done to stop the incursion and to prevent it from happening again. If serious enough, DOD will come in or has given itself the authority to come in and conduct a forensic analysis of the company's information security systems. Next slide. So the DOD, the DFARS that will go into effect at the end of this year require you to have a system of controls that basically meets NIST 800-171. If you don't, or if you deviate, you need to be able to explain why, and why what you have gives an equivalent level of protection. The regs require you also to have a system security plan, and it imposes a 72-hour notice period. Those are the basics. This slide just goes over quickly what the other rules, what else is out there. There is a FAR cybersecurity rule. It went into effect last year. It just states very high-level goals or objectives for your system. There's really no specificity. There's a proposed rule from DHS that was proposed at the beginning of this year. The most significant portion of that rule, if it becomes final, is that it will require accreditation of your system, and that accreditation must be done by a third party. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. This slide summarizes what some other agencies do, and you'll see that probably the most prevalent or common thing is an IT security plan, training, very fast breach negotiation. HUD requires immediate breach notification. The IRS requires a 1-hour turnaround. So if you've got contracts with these agencies, you should take a look at, if you haven't done already, what they require. Next slide. So now we come to how are we getting ready for the end of the year in terms of cybersecurity, and more generally, because we expect FAR requirements to come out pretty quickly. Don't assume that the current administration's objective of reducing regulations will slow down or stop cyber regulation. It's important to note that one of the key aspects of this administration's executive order is to tamp down on the .gov space, recognizing that it's not very secure, which will mean government agencies, one, will be much harder on their contractors, but two, it may also create opportunities for contractors to come in and take care of the government systems for them. Next slide. In terms of being preparation, I know this sounds difficult, but it's really the most important thing you can do, is to maintain a current inventory of what unclassified controlled information is in your system and where it resides. Where did it come from? And what specific agency contract requirements apply to it? In our experience is that if a company has a breach, the first, there's just this flurry, this intense activity that surrounds, oh my God, what contracts do we have? What information was touched, and what do the contracts require? Next slide. You need to update your policies. You need to make sure that your cyber or information security policy complies with NIST 800-171 or whatever else that might be applicable to your company. You also need to review your third-party agreement to make sure that they protect you. Next slide. As with any compliance requirement, education of employees is extremely important. and employees need to be aware of the reporting requirements, and they need to have a uniform understanding of what a security breach is that requires reporting. Next slide. You have to worry about if you use cloud providers. That's another area where you will need to review your contracts with them to make sure that they understand what's required of them, because they will be holding DOD information. Next slide. Next slide. And finally, if you are in the position of having subcontractors, you need to slow down the cyber requirements. You need to make sure they completely understand what the reporting chain is in the event of a breach. And in your agreements, you should be thinking about how to indemnify yourself from any harm and asking them to certify that their systems comply with what's required by DOD and the other agencies. And with that, I'll stop to see if there are any questions.
Great information. Thanks so much, Mary Beth, for joining us and sharing great insight on what's required for the cyber deadline that's approaching. If anybody has any questions, please direct them directly to Mary Beth. Her email address is here, marybeth.bosco@hklaw.com, and she'll be happy to help you. If you want to join in on any of our other webinars this week, we're covering bid protest, indirect rates, and various other topics. You can find those on our website, and all the recordings will be listed later this afternoon from last week. Thanks again, Mary Beth, and thanks to all the attendees who joined us today.
Thank you.